Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Northwest Craftsman. Today we're going to be putting together my first cross sled, which means that it's going to be dead simple, no bells and whistles, and it should go together quickly, and it should be exactly what I need to get me started. All right, let's go. While I'm getting everything set up, I wanted to talk a little bit about crosscut sleds and how I designed this. So a crosscut sled is arguably one of the most useful jigs or tools that you're going to have around the shop. There's a lot of versatility with it. You can do a lot of different types of cuts with it, and it allows you to do things that no other tool can do, and it lets you utilize your table saw more effectively. When you're designing a crosscut sled, one of the rules of thumbs that I've heard is that you should design it to cover about the top of your table saw. The reason you do this is because then it's pretty well supported all the way around, and you're not going to try and cut anything that's too large for your table saw to start with. Not to mention that the larger you make your crosscut sled, the heavier and more unwieldy it gets to move around because it won't likely be sitting on your table saw the entire time. So you're going to need to take it off, put it back on. So making one about the size of your table saw, unless you've got a giant cabinet saw, usually accomplishes a pretty good balance. In my case, I got pretty lucky that the width I was going for was 48 inches, which happens to be exactly the width of a piece of plywood. This meant that basically all of the components I was looking for could be made with a single cut across the sheet of plywood like you're seeing here. So the dead simple crosscut sled really only has three pieces: a base, your front fence, and your back fence. All those little pieces that I just cut off there were the front and back fence that I will laminate up shortly, and then this is the base for the crosscut sled. With everything cut out, I'm going to go ahead and get everything set up so that I can see roughly what it's going to look like. You can see here that I'm going to laminate three pieces of that plywood in order to make each one of the different fences. And then the base is just going to be that one solitary piece of 1/2-inch plywood. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start speeding things up a little bit. When designing your fences, 2.5 to 3.5 inches should be enough for just about every table saw, but just make sure to double check your blade and what the depth of cut is going to be so that you don't cut all the way through your crosscut sled. Also, this is a good time to remind you that when you're laminating, use lots of clamps. So while I'm laminating this together, one of the questions that I've heard or that I was seeing often is, why would you use plywood for a crosscut sled as opposed to just solid lumber? And the reason is because plywood is much more dimensionally stable in changes in heat and humidity than regular lumber is, and you want to make sure that your crosscut sled is staying very, very precisely tuned. You'll see later on in this process how difficult it is to get everything tuned just right so that everything is accurate, and plywood helps you to maintain this through the entire process. So during this point in the process of the lamination, you can see that I actually clamped both of them together. As long as you have an unglued surface together and everything's the same dimension, it makes it really easy to clamp everything together. I also have cauls on both ends and in the middle to make sure that all of my plywood lines up properly. Now my cauls just consist of 1x2s with packing tape. Here is another view post-lamination. You can see all of that excess glue squeezing out at each one of the different joints. You want to make sure that you at least have a little bit of glue coming out of every joint to make sure that you actually had enough. Let those guys sit all night and then go ahead and crack them all open. If you make sure to wipe off all of the wood glue before it dries, then you don't have to go through this step, but because I let it dry, I'm going to go ahead and chip it all off so that I can do one final pass on the table saw to just clean up one edge. With the base and both fences done, everything is ready for the dead simple crosscut sled. At least all of the necessary components. There's two other components that I wanted to add to this, one to keep my fingers safe and one to allow me to extend my blade a little bit further. Here's how you make them. So both of them are actually going to stem from this extra piece that I cut. It's 3 inches wide just like everything else because I wanted it to be the same height. Now this first piece is to keep my fingers safe from the blade as it's coming through or from the saw as it's coming through, because sometimes the saw will come through the backside of your crosscut sled just a little bit as you're finishing up a cut, and this is to remind my thumbs to stay out of the way. There's not even anything really all that fancy about it. It's literally just cutting 2 extra 6-inch pieces of wood that we're going to glue on at the very end, and it just provides a bump behind that area where the saw is going to come through so that it's harder for your fingers to get in the way. This next piece is also really simple. Essentially, it's just going to be a little bit of extra piece of wood that's going to go over the top of where the blade interfaces with the fence to provide it with a little bit more support so that I can bring the blade further up, get a deeper depth of cut without weakening the support all the way across. The laminating process works exactly the same as the fences, lots of clamps and cauls. Once you've let those sit overnight, you're going to go ahead and move this over to the miter saw, and you're just going to cut 45s on each one of the sides so that it just transitions nicely. Now this isn't strictly necessary, it just looks a lot better in my mind. Once all of those components have been made, now it's time to make the miter bars. Now the miter bars don't have to be made out of plywood, and in fact I would recommend that you just make them out of a hardwood. You just need them to be a runner that's going to go all the way along the bottom, and they're going to take a decent amount of abuse as they slide back and forth through the slots. There are some pretty standard sizes on the miter slots themselves, but I would go ahead and just measure them anyways. In my case, it was about 3/4 of an inch wide by 3/8 of an inch deep. Now, the width you want to get pretty close because this is going to be how tight you ride in the groove, but the depth you can be a little bit more shallow on because you just need it to align with the miter slots and not actually ride on the bottom. And in fact, you don't want it to ride on the bottom so that the bottom of your crosscut sled as a whole can ride on the top of your table saw. You can see here that they're a little bit loose, but there's a solution to that, and it's to shim it out. So when you're going to be gluing these to the bottom of your base, you can go ahead and shim out the sides, and you're going to want to make sure that you shim them either both to the inside or both to the outside. If you shim both of them to the right or to the left, you're not going to do any good because your whole crosscut sled can move one direction or the other. The idea of the shims is that you want to take up all of the slack. Before you start gluing, you need to make sure that your miter bars are up. I used popsicle sticks to do this. What you can do is you can use washers, nuts, popsicle sticks in my case, and all you're trying to do is elevate the miter bars so that they sit outside of the miter slots so that you have access to glue them without gluing it straight to your table. The reason you need to glue your base to these miter bars while it's on your table is because this is going to give you the precise alignment that you need. Anything outside is not going to give you enough alignment, and you can see from the small adjustments that we're going to make later that the little things do make a huge difference. With everything in place, make sure that your blade is out of the way, apply a light layer of glue, spread that glue nice and evenly, set your base on top, and then load it up with as much weight as you can. Ideally, you're going to want to let this sit all night so that it has the maximum holding strength, since the glue is going to be the only thing holding this in place. You can also put screws into this, but those are going to come in after this glue has set. You'll flip it upside down, put them in through the back side. Just make sure that they don't pop out the front and you've got the correct depth. While this glue is drying, I wanted to show you guys a little bit of what those extra components are going to look like. First up, this is what the little fence support looks like. It literally just provides a little bit of support right over where the blade's coming through so that we've got a little bit extra material. At the very end, I'll just be gluing this on the top, and I may even throw a screw or two through there just to make sure that it sits firm. Just want to make sure that the screws are well out of the way of the blade. And then here's the finger guard. It's not really a true guard, it's just a reminder to keep my fingers out of the way because you kind of bump into it if you're going to get anywhere close. This guy as well is just going to get glued on right there at the end once everything else is complete. With the glue set up and ready to go, I'm going to go ahead and unload it, and then I'm going to start assembling everything. When you're attaching the fences to the base, the back isn't going to matter for specific alignment, so you just want to make sure that it's aligned with the edge of your sled so that it looks good. Now, you want to make sure it's not grossly out of alignment, but you should have done this when you were cutting the base and it was square. Once everything is clamped in place, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start drilling pilot holes all the way through, and then we're going to fill in screws right behind it, and we're just going to space them every 6 to 8 inches, really what feels right and sturdy for you. The front fence is a little bit different because it's going to require adjustment. An excellent way of doing this adjustment is with the 5-cut method. In order to do this, you're going to install 2 screws to start with. One is going to be your pivot screw, and one is just going to be a holding screw that you're going to use to hold everything in place. In my case, the first one that I put in, or the one on my right, is the one that I'm going to be using as a pivot. Before we get started, we need to cut the actual slot. Here I'm just testing to make sure that the crosscut sled feels good as it's coming across. It's not sticking, it's not binding, and then it's nice and sturdy inside of the slots. You should get basically no wobble, if any wobble at all, when you're trying to move this laterally. Next up, go ahead and cut the slot by just literally pushing it straight through the blade. Make sure you keep your fingers clear because we don't have any guards in the way yet. Next up, I'm going to be doing the 5-cut method. Basically, you want to take a 4-sided piece of lumber that is roughly square. It's just going to help you keep track of things a little bit. And then you're going to start by cutting off one side, rotate it around so that side is on the bottom, and then you're going to take a cut off of the remaining sides until you have the same side on the bottom that you started with, so you get to a 5th cut. Next, we want to track the leading side and the trailing side. Now, we want to do this because we're going to be tracking which one was bigger because that tells us which direction we need to move things. Marking the leading side and the trailing side. And then I like to use a calipers for this because it's going to be more accurate than any of the other tools that I'm normally using in the shop. And in this particular case, I want to have the highest accuracy possible. So start by measuring both sides and make sure to write down what the leading side and trailing side were. Subtract your trailing side from your leading side, and this basically gets you the cut error. Then, just like you saw me do, you're going to divide by 4 because you basically have that much error over all 4 faces. I forgot to do one step right here, but fixed it later. Once you have that number, which is your error per one side, you're going to divide that by the total length of the piece that you just cut off. This is going to give you your error per inch. Once you have your error per inch, you want to go ahead and measure from your pivot screw all the way to the end of your front fence. Multiply your error per inch by this length, and then it tells you how much you need to move the end of your fence by. In this particular configuration, with the pivot on the right and the free end of the fence on the left, if your error per inch was negative, meaning that your leading side is smaller than your trailing side, then the left side of that fence is going to move towards you, not towards the center of your base. Likewise, if it was the opposite, you're going to move it in. The other thing that you can do, which I had to do for myself, is just look at it as you're going through, and if you move the left side of the fence forward, is it going to get smaller or larger on the leading and trailing side? You can use this to do a BS check for which direction you're supposed to go. Next, take your calipers and set them to the correct depth, and then at the end of your board, use them to set it either in or out to the correct depth. Clamp it down. Then drill another pilot and put the same screw into that hole, not the pre-existing one, because the pre-existing one will pull the fence off course. With the adjustment made, go ahead and do another 5-cut test and then remeasure your sample. With these adjustments, I was able to cut my error down to about 19 thousandths of an inch over 27 inches. Now, 27 inches is the overall capacity of my sled, which means that I would have to cut something as large as my sled in order to see 19 thousandths of error. Anything smaller is going to see less error overall. This is well within the tolerances that I'm planning on using in my shop, and so overall I would say that this is mission accomplished. Once you have all of that set in place, you're going to go ahead and drill more pilots just like you did on the rear fence, and then you're going to throw screws in to keep everything secure. Make sure to space these out so that it holds everything firmly in place, and then also make sure to avoid anywhere that the saw is going to be so that you don't get screws in the same place. It is worth noting that this is an iterative test, meaning that, if you got absolutely lucky and mounted your fence perfectly perpendicular the very first time, you would only have to do the 5-cut test once to verify, but more than likely, at a minimum, you're going to be doing it twice. Once to measure how far you're off, and then once to verify the adjustment that you made from that initial measurement. Next, we're going to glue up those 2 additional features that go beyond the bare bones crosscut sled. This one specifically is to help protect my fingers from where the blade may be popping through the backside of the crosscut sled a little bit. Not necessary, but it just is a good reminder to keep my fingers out of the way. When I was gluing this on, you literally just clamp it in place and then wipe all the excess glue off, and then it's good to go. And then this guy provides the fence just with a little bit of support as my depth of cut increases. Thank you guys for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I hope that you learned a little bit about how simple it is to make a functional crosscut sled, and this guy is going to be just dead on accurate for me for all the projects that I need to do. And again, you can always measure tighter and tighter and tighter when you're doing it, but for all of my projects, especially for a beginning crosscut sled, this is going to be just perfect. I can always go through and make a very, very high precision one when I'm coming through it next time. But I hope that you guys learned a little bit about the basics of making a cross sled. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave it in the comment section down below. And if you like the kind of videos we're putting out here at Northwest Craftsman, love to get a thumbs up on the video and a subscription to the channel. We're watching our community grow, and it's just fantastic. So thank you guys very much. Really appreciate it if you're already subscribed, and love having you around. Thank you guys for all the good questions, and we'll see you next time. Have a great one. Stay cool. Bye.